I'm really sorry about my voice. I've lost my voice because I've got bronchitis, but I'm going to soldier on anyway. I have something a little different for you today. It's October, and with October comes Inktober, a worldwide event started by Jake Parker, where tens of thousands of people challenge themselves to create an ink drawing every day for the month, with the aim of improving their drawing skills. Last week, I got my ink pens out and I created 2 drawings that I'll share with you. These jonquils and this really easy pen and wash rose. If you'd like to take part in the Inktober challenge, I've left a link to Jake's website in the description of the video where you can find out more. A really good book if you want to learn more about drawing in ink is this book here by Alphonso Dunn called Pen and Ink Drawing: A Simple Guide. There's a section on the different supplies you can use, all the different strokes that you can make with the pen. There's a section on shading. It's quite a good book. It's easy to read and it's filled with lots of useful information about drawing with ink. One of the ways you can make a mark with ink is to stipple with the pen, which is what I did when I drew these jonquils. I used the pen and I created tiny little dots of ink all over the drawing. It's very time consuming, but it's relaxing. I put the TV on while I was doing it and I got lost in my own little ink world. I worked on a piece of Arches hot pressed watercolour board and I used these Sakura Pigma micron pens. They're archival and they're filled with pigment ink. They're water-based, they dry quickly and the ink is waterproof, which is important if you want to use watercolour with the ink. I needed a slightly larger ink pen for the dark areas, so I used a Tombow calligraphy pen as well in a few places. I'll show you the jonquil drawing first, and then we'll have a look at the pen and wash rose. This is my reference photo that I took. To make it easier for myself, I turned the photo black and white in Photoshop, and that allowed me to see the tonal values more easily. I started my drawing with the Pigma Micron pen. This is a number 3. I had to start somewhere, so I chose a petal on this flower up the top and off I went. I ended up working with 4 tonal variations. I had light, medium and dark, and also the white of the paper. In the darkest areas, I put the dots really close together. In the medium value areas, I spread them out a bit further and I had more white space between them. And in the light areas, I had even more white space between my dots. And then, of course, in the lightest areas of all, I left the white of the paper showing. It was important that I resisted the urge to draw lines at this stage. I needed to relax and get in the flow of stippling. This wasn't going to happen in a hurry, so I might as well enjoy the process. I decided that the stems were the darkest areas, so I wanted to fill them in completely with ink. And I realised pretty quickly that if I used this little pen to do that, I'd be there till Christmas. So I found this old calligraphy pen of mine. This is a Tombow made in Japan calligraphy pen. And it's quite a bit thicker than the micron pen that I was using. So then I started to dab at that section that I wanted to be really dark. I didn't know whether to continue stippling the way I was with the thinner pen or whether I should just fill it in. So I compromised and I drew little strokes like this. I thought I could leave a little bit of white paper showing here if I want to. I wasn't sure how it was going to look, but I went for it anyway, and in the end I was quite happy with it. The left side of the stem was a bit lighter, so I started stippling with that pen. I left a bit of the white of the paper showing there. And then I went back with this thicker pen into my darkest areas, and I stippled over the top just to deepen the colour down in those areas. The stippled dots were so close together there that it didn't matter really what thickness pen I used. You can see here I've got the dots really close together on the stem and on the left side of the flower where the darkest shadow is. Now I'm starting to put a bit more space between them on the mid-tone area. On the lightest area of the petal, I'll leave the white of the paper showing. Once I got the shape of it established, I came back with the thicker Tombow pen to deepen the colour in the darkest areas. On the flower above, you can see I've included some lost edges around the outside where there aren't any dots at all. I try to do the same thing when I'm painting in watercolour because it helps to add some depth. Not every edge needs to be clearly defined. On this dark area here, I used the thicker Tombow pen. I was putting them so close together that it didn't matter if the dots were larger here. Here I've switched back to my smaller pen, the Pigma Micron. There's a lighter area there. I also tried to simplify it as much as I could. For most of the drawing, I tried to hold the pen as upright as I could. And I took regular breaks because your hand can get sore. I worked on it probably about 5 hours all up. I think I probably worked on this. Not all at once. I took regular breaks and I worked on it over 2 days. With this petal here, I wanted to leave some lost edges. So I just did the minimal amount of work I had to do there. Just a few dots to suggest the shape of the petal. There's no need for me to fill it all in. I tended to get my dark areas in first, and then I worked the lighter areas around the dark. I cut my paper quite small. It's 17 centimetres by 25 centimetres. I didn't want to do anything too large because I knew it would take me weeks to finish. Here on the stem, I used the larger pen and I simplified that area. I didn't feel it was necessary to add any detail down in that dark spot. With this little bud down here, it's in shadow, so I used my smaller pen to draw some dots all over it. I got in the darker edge first on the left, and then I started to space them out more. But I still needed to cover it with the dots. It's time consuming, but once you start to get the hang of it, you can start to work quicker. Here I've switched to my bigger pen and I'm starting to add a bit more of the ink to those darker areas. Here I was starting to get to the end of it. This is the last flower now. Most of the drawing was done with dots, but I did use the pen to draw some lines to define some edges here and there. Then when I finished, I went back and added a few more dots here and there until I was happy with it. As I said, I think it took me about 5 hours to complete, and it was quite relaxing once I got going. It's a good exercise to make you look closely at value changes and how those values work to create the form of the subject that you're drawing. It was time consuming, but I enjoyed it, and it made me look closely at all those different value changes. Now I'll show you the pen and wash rose that I did. I've painted this particular rose twice before in watercolour, years ago. The paintings are hanging in one of our spare bedrooms. I used a different reference photo for this drawing, but it's the same rose. This was really quick and simple to paint, and it might be great for a greeting card or something like that. I'm using Arches hot press paper here as well. I transferred my line drawing onto the paper. Now I'm using one of those pens to ink in the pencil lines. It was quite straightforward. I didn't do anything fancy here. There were a few really dark areas that I shaded in quickly with the pen. And I could have done it the other way around. I could have painted the watercolour on first and then used the pen over the top, so it doesn't really matter what order I do it in. Then I went back and I thickened some of the lines here and there, and that added a bit of variation in the stroke width. After it was all inked in, I used my eraser on it to get rid of any pencil lines that I could still see, and then I wet the rose with some water. I painted on a very pale wash of raw sienna all over the top. This is my number 5 Da Vinci Maestro brush. I mixed some green from French Ultramarine and Windsor Lemon, and I painted that on there before it dried, just in a few places where I could see green, mainly on the reference photo. I painted the water on there to give me a bit more time to get the paint on before it dried. I saw a bit of green there, so I painted that on. Keeping everything quite pale at this stage. While I had the green there, I washed in the sepals and the stem. I did that really loosely, just a splash of colour, not trying to be too careful. Then I wanted to add some pink to the petals, but I wanted to be a bit more careful where I placed it. So I dried the rose off with the hairdryer, and now I'm re-wetting this main petal here with some water. Just keeping the water on the petal. I used some permanent rose then, and that bled over the wet paper. Spread the paint out where I wanted it, but mostly I let the paint do what it wanted to do. I let it bleed over the paper. I need a bit up in here. I wet this section as well with some water, and I put some permanent rose there too. I kept wetting each section as I did it. Okay, so this is the last of the permanent rose now. Then I got out some permanent alizarin crimson. I dried it off really well with the hairdryer, and then I wet each petal again separately with some water. I wanted to put the paint on there and I wanted it to bleed gently like it has been. This is permanent alizarin crimson. I got my little Zero brush and I used the pigment quite thick, so I only mixed a small amount of water with it. And I painted that onto the wet paper where I wanted it. It bled over the paper, but not too much because it's quite thick. So I gave it a little push where I wanted it. Here I've actually taken the paint out of my brush and I'm using the paint that's on the paper to push it down a bit further. I wet the next section with some water, and while the water is still glossy, I get some more of the permanent alizarin crimson, quite thick and dark, and I paint that onto the wet paper. I don't want to completely cover my underwash. I still want to see a bit of that raw sienna showing. Like it is on the reference photo, you can see some lighter colour there. Any edges I didn't like, I took away with my damp brush. And then I got a bit more pigment and dropped that on there while it was wet to deepen the colour there in that section. And like I did before with the permanent rose, I wet each petal one at a time and I worked section by section. And this is the last little turned back section that I'm doing now. Once this was painted on, I dried it off with my hairdryer so I could paint on some shadows. For the shadows, I used French Ultramarine and Windsor Lemon, but I also put a small amount of the permanent rose into it to tone it down slightly and make it look a bit more natural looking. The shadows I painted on dry paper, just where I saw them on the reference photo. I took the photo of this rose in the sunshine and it had definite hard edge cast shadows. So there was no need for me to paint these shadows on the wet paper. Dry paper gave me those hard edges, which is what I was looking for. I keep the paint fairly watered down so you can see those other layers underneath. I mixed some more French Ultramarine into my green mixture and I deepened the colour on the sepals and the stem. I take that paint out of my brush now and I smooth away that edge at the bottom just with the damp brush. I dried it off with the hairdryer and then I saw a few more darker areas. I used the pen to draw those in though. I thickened a few more edges as well, and I did that to create some variation, as I said before. A few little directional lines here and there. And then I decided I could bring some of these turned over sections a bit more forward, so I wet the turned over part with some water, and then I used permanent alizarin crimson again, really quite dark. It's straight out of the tube here going onto the wet paper. I let the water on the paper disperse the pigment. All I do is place it where I want it, give it a little push if I need to. But otherwise the water and the paper take care of that for me. I wet this curved over part as well, and this is more permanent alizarin crimson. Full strength. And I did that on any area that I wanted to bring a bit closer to the viewer. There it is there. I think all up it took me probably about an hour or so to do it, and it was a bit of fun. That's as much as I can manage to get done for Inktober this year. I wish I had more time. If you're going to take part, good luck with it, have fun, and I hope you improve your drawing and inking skills. Next week I've got something different again. I'm going to give you a look at this painting that I did a few weeks ago. I'm looking forward to sharing that with you. Thanks for watching. Please give this video a like and subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you next week. I'm really sorry about my voice. I have bronchitis. You're just going to have to suck it up. Yeah. That's good. Yeah. Well, you're going to leave that in? No. And that didn't sound very good. I've got to do all of that again. Yep. All right, let's do it. I've done this before. A good book if you want to learn. One of the maze, you can make a mark. I'll show you the I've painted this particular rose twice before in watercolour. Oops.